And welcome to this pre-US election edition of IIEA Insights. Today, legal scholar and political analyst Larry Donnelly joins us to examine the checks and balances that constrain presidential power in the United States, and in particular, how various restraints on the executive might play out if they were to be tested. So with that, Larry, many thanks for giving us your time today. A lot to get through, as we've discussed before this. But let's start with something that I think maybe doesn't get as much attention from those of us who live in unitary states, is the federal dimension. That US presidents have fewer domestic powers, at least, than a lot of European prime ministers, because areas of competence are with the states. All the states have their own constitutions and legislatures and governors. And that could be a protection for US democracy if there were to be overreach by an incumbent of the White House. Give me your thoughts on that and how power is diffused and what you think that means for the protection of democracy in the United States.
Yeah, Dan. Well, first of all, thanks a million for asking me, and it's an absolute pleasure to be with you all virtually here on the cusp of an historic election to look at some of the bigger, I suppose, broader issues. And a lot of this addresses the question of American federalism, which is an extremely complicated topic. And put simply, it refers to the division of powers between state and federal governments. But there is a lot of ambiguity there, and there are seeming rules, and then there are exceptions to rules, and all of this goes to make up the vast American democracy that we see, for good or for ill. And the question really today is, what kind of constraints might there be, or are there on the presidency? Are there on the federal government? I think the first thing it's worth saying is that when, back in 1776. We had something called the Articles of Confederation before we had the United States Constitution. And those Articles of Confederation arguably gave too much power to state authorities. Again, federalism is the idea that there's a balance or division of power between the centralized national government and the individual states. The Articles of Confederation gave too much power to the states. And as a consequence, one of the things that the drafters of the Constitution wanted to do was to restore a more appropriate, more fitting balance. So to have that central authority, but to preserve what U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis once said, states were sort of laboratories of democracy. So to preserve that sort of balance. And so it went. As I suppose, limits on the national powers perhaps may have been tested in the 1930s in the New Deal legislation, when President Roosevelt pushed through a number of new government agencies that were there in response to the Great Depression, which had catastrophic economic impacts throughout the United States. We perhaps saw the revenge of those who were states' rights activists in the Reagan presidency during the 1980s. But there always has been a balance between the two. And there are certain things allocated to the federal government, but according to the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution, what isn't specifically granted to the federal government is reserved to the states. So that's the overarching framework in which we operate. There have been certain pushes and pulls throughout American history and a patchy quiltwork of Supreme Court decisions on the topic. But put in short form, it is this idea of a balance. And again, states are there in some ways to counterbalance at local level the power of an overarching federal government. And that comes in the context of a system in which the Founding Fathers deliberately did not want an overly strong presidency. They wanted a president. They didn't want a dictator.
And looking at a specific topic, there's been mention of going after people and sort of revenge against political opponents during the current general presidential election campaign. I'm wondering, in terms of law enforcement powers between the federal and state level, I understand that most police forces are not, obviously not federal; they're state level. Does that mean that, if there was some sort of effort to go after political rivals, that the exercise of law enforcement is primarily done by at state level. And would that, for example, limit the power of any president to go after political rivals?
The answer is possibly. The answer is it depends, really. In terms of, the powers of the states, states each have their own criminal laws, their own criminal codes, which govern basic criminal offenses, from those that are very serious to those that are very minor. Then, of course, there are federal laws that cover a whole host of topics, and there are subjects of which are federal jurisdiction. I mean, at a very colloquial level, people will be familiar with watching American films where you have local law enforcement involved, and then all of a sudden the FBI comes in, and the local law enforcement says, "Oh no, the feds are here." And when it comes to elections, for instance, we saw last time around, or in 2020, pressure having been exerted on state officials with respect to state election laws. States govern their own elections. They follow their own elections. That can't happen. But in terms of federal charges and the potential for weaponization of federal agencies to pursue individuals for federal crimes, it's an open question, the extent to which state and local law enforcement can act as a buttress against that. So, in some respects, we would be in uncharted waters if there were to be that sort of weaponization and that sort of conflict at that level. I'm not saying it's unlikely, but it hasn't hugely surfaced. I mean, I think you talk about the civil rights movement and those sorts of things in the 1960s. Some of those tensions came to the surface, but as of in recent history, we haven't seen that sort of thing play out. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but we haven't seen it.
Okay. Coming back to a more conventional aspect of the debate, I suppose one of the biggest constraints or check and balance on any president is Congress. Um, in terms of just more politically, how I see realclearpolitics.com is showing that congressional swing towards the Republicans. What's your view on who control both houses of Congress after next week?
Well, it's all but certain that the Republicans will have the Senate. They are certain, barring something no one could foresee, that they will take the seat currently held by Joe Manchin, the conservative Democrat turned independent in West Virginia. The Republicans will gain that. And this is in a context where Democrats have a 51-49 advantage currently. That brings it to 50-50. If you look at the state of Montana, the incumbent Democrat there is in trouble. He's behind by several percentage points in the polls. It seems to me very likely that he will lose his seat. There is also the potential that they could lose seats in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio, depending on how things go at the top of the ticket. So my own view is that the Senate will go to Republican control. Just a quick side note about the Senate: the way that it operates is really, I suppose, labyrinthine and difficult to get one's head around, but very many votes to get through the Senate. You need 60 votes. So the Senate moves at glacial speed, but still, for a whole host of reasons, Republicans taking control even marginally would be significant. The House is, Democrats still have hope of potentially retaking the House. Republicans have a very slim majority right now, 6 or 7 seats, just a handful of seats. But even in a context where most congressional districts in the United States are not competitive, they've been gerrymandered to the effect that they're either solidly Democrat or solidly Republican. There are a limited number of places where things really are up for grabs, no matter how it goes at the top of the ticket. So Democrats are hopeful. I think it would have to be a good day. It would have to be a good day for Kamala Harris at the top, and have to be a good day for them to regain control. So look, if both houses of the Congress go to Republican control and Donald Trump is elected president, then he will have a significant amount of control and power at the top. And again, one of the things I said at the outset was that the founding fathers did not want a very strong presidency. Well, Trump, even with small majorities in the two houses, would be a very strong president.
I'm trying to avoid personalizing this because I think often the debate is too much about the personalities rather than the structure in which they operate. But I have to ask here that if the Republicans were to take both houses and Donald Trump were to be elected, um, historically, if a president has both houses, it makes it easier to to move things, the legislative agenda forward. But is it fair to say that Trump has a pretty unusual sway over his own party compared to previous Republican and Democrat presidents? And the combination of having both houses and his very strong sway over the party, would that make him an unusually powerful president?
Yes, and to further depoliticize it, Dan, it's not unusual to Trump nowadays that we have parties that are very loyal that toe the line. So it's not he's not unique in that respect. And that's down to, I suppose, the mounting polarization in American politics. I'll make this concrete for people in a very real way. If you look at January 1993, when Bill Clinton came into office, he had absolutely mammoth majorities in both the House of Representatives and in the United States Senate. Now, he got a few things done, but he didn't get an awful lot of things done. For instance, despite the composition of the Congress, he couldn't get health care reform passed. And that's because back then, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party were not monolithic. They comprised a variety of different ideologies. Now they are much more likely to be all singing off the same hymn sheet with very little diversion. So, as such, in that context, a president of either party who has control of both houses of Congress is de facto a very strong president because, in all likelihood, they will be able to push an awful lot of their agenda through.
And I suppose that brings us to the other great federal institution, the Supreme Court, that if a president were to push laws through and Congress were to go along with that and enact them, and there was constitutional doubts or they exceeded the powers they breached the Constitution in some way, clearly the very litigious country America is, that would be taken to the Supreme Court. How do you see, and of course, the Supreme Court of the US is much more politicized, and some of its justices were appointed by Donald Trump in his previous administration. How even-handed would you see a Supreme Court being if there were questions about breaches of the Constitution and things that might erode democracy in America?
There's no question that, regrettably, in another regrettably unique American phenomenon, that the court is a political institution. And it's not Trump who made it a political institution. It's been a political institution for decades. That is the fact. Now, the court is, of a conservative bent. There's no question about that. But the reality is the law is the law. And even those who attack this Supreme Court, in particular for its decision on the scope of presidential immunity, the reality is this court has also pushed back on the former president on a number of different occasions, largely in the context of various legal proceedings he's ensnared in. But the court has pushed back. And what I would say is that the law is the law. And what we see from the outside, people who don't follow the court very closely, we see the divided decisions that sometimes come down on partisan lines. We don't see the very, very many decisions where the court is pretty unified. And when it comes to these big picture issues about the powers, about the deep constitutional issues that go to the very essence of American democracy, my own view is the court is likely to come down on the side of the Constitution, that of course they all have personal ideologies and dispositions, but that they will ultimately uphold the sworn duty that they take to uphold the Constitution.
And just on the subject of the Constitution, Ari, is there a possibility the Constitution itself could be changed? Just talk us through this sort of supermajority that's needed to change the Constitution in the US.
Yeah, it's something I cover a lot with my own students here because of how relatively easy it is to amend Bunrat and Heron compared to the United States Constitution. To amend the United States Constitution, the first thing that needs to be done is you need to get someone to propose the amendment, and then for 2/3 of both houses of Congress to agree that this is a good idea. And anyone who's watched Washington for the last number of years will recognize how very, very difficult that is. Then following that, you would need to get 4/5 of the state legislatures to go along with whatever proposed constitutional change there is. So, in the current climate in the United States, amending the Constitution, if not impossible, is extremely, extremely difficult. And it's hard for me to envisage as I sit here an issue that would be sponsored by politicians. Again, that's of course an important part to get it started, that could get that level of support. So I don't see that happening in the imminent future anyway.
There's been a proposal put about in recent times that the number of justices on the Supreme Court be expanded, effectively an idea to pack the Supreme Court. How difficult would that be to do? Is that a constitutional matter that would, as you say, require almost impossible to do, or is that a simple legislative thing where they could expand? And I'm sorry, we didn't discuss this beforehand, so I hope I'm not putting you on the spot with this, Larry.
No, that's fine. No, this actually, again, down to the constitutional language, the scholars are at one with this, and I agree with them that yes, the judges now appointed to the federal bench enjoy life tenure, and that is a constitutional provision. But that having been said, in terms of the number of judges, in terms of where they sit, in terms of things like term limits and other proposals, there are elegant solutions that can be done of this short of amending the Constitution. So these things are not pie in the sky. They actually can be achieved. And I think that, to be frank, they would have a groundswell of support among the American people, because if you look at the polling data, whether it is recent controversial decisions made by the Supreme Court or a whole host of reasons, the United States Supreme Court is at its historical nadir in terms of American public opinion. It is down there with Congress. Congress has always been pretty broadly loathed, but the United States Supreme Court, which had quite an elevated standing, is now down very low. So efforts to either restrict the court's jurisdiction, which can be done pursuant to the Constitution, that don't require an amendment, or to change the composition or the tenure of the Supreme Court, that can be accomplished without going through that arduous amendment process.
Okay, so then there is a possibility that a president, particularly with both houses of Congress, could change the rules of the game and change the number of justices and put people on who would be, very much yes people.
The number of judges is more complicated. The easier done one is the idea of term limits for Supreme Court judges. That is, you would not be stripping them of their lifetime tenure as federal judges. They simply would go to other courts. They would sit elsewhere, and they could be replaced on a rotating basis. That's the one that most of the people who want court reform think is more plausible and an easier sell for a whole host of reasons. And, look, I can speak to personal experience. The lifetime tenure thing for federal judges at every level is not a good idea. I think that some judges sit on for way too long, and I think for a whole host of reasons, not just the ideological ones that are at the heart of some of this. It's not a good idea.
Okay. So could I sum up and say that you'd feel reasonably confident that the Supreme Court will act as a bulwark against any sort of president with tyrannical tendencies, shall we say?
I do, and I say that especially because he hasn't won every argument, but the Chief Justice, John Roberts, who is a conservative, he hasn't won the arguments on everything, but he's won a lot of them. And he is a very strong force within that court. And what I think animates him above all else is the institutional reputation of the court and its place in American democracy. Again, he hasn't won everything, but I think his status and stature should not be overlooked in that context.
And just flipping back to the similar question on Congress, that particularly if Congress were the House was to go one way, the Senate the other, how important would that be in terms of checking abuse of power, efforts to do things that would go outside the sort of democratic norms?
Yeah, hugely important because if you look at the powers that are expressly allocated to the president, they are subject to in many instances to congressional approval. For instance, the appointment of a whole range of federal officials who have a huge sway, not just judges but others, are typically subject to confirmation processes, et cetera, through the United States Senate. The House, of course, has a big role to play in terms of treaties and money and all that sort of thing. So they are an important break on the presidency. So yes, they are vital institutions in all of this. And that's why sometimes some of the narrative over here that Trump can somehow completely run roughshod over American democracy, in my view, is misplaced.
Okay, interesting. So you think from that the congressional race is almost as important as the presidential race, even though the presidential race certainly over here gets all the attention.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, what I always say to people who are interested in American politics, and especially people who are vested in American politics for a whole host of reasons, be they business or whatever, yes, the natural thing is to follow the presidential election because it's the one that garners all the attention. But oftentimes, for a whole host of reasons, what happens in the House and the Senate can play an even bigger role in dictating the course of American legislation and a whole foreign policy and a whole host of other things.
You mentioned the requirement for the Senate to confirm appointments for a whole raft of things. One of the big differences between Europe and the US is just how thick a layer of the bureaucracy is appointed by the president, whereas we have what we often call the permanent government here. Very few people would use that term, or maybe not even understand that term in the United States, given how much the president can bring their own people in towards the federal bureaucracy. Um, Trump has not only has said that not only, of course, he's going to bring his own people in, but he's also talked about firing non-political civil servants. Um, how much of how different do you see a presidency under Trump in terms of that process of populating the bureaucracy in Washington?
Yeah, it's a really good question with several layers to it. First, I should say that this is not some sort of hypothetical issue. In October of 2020, late in Donald Trump's presidency, he signed an executive order effectively empowering him to do lots of these things. And obviously, he wasn't reelected, so he didn't get to act on it. So he certainly is of the view that there are very many federal employees, and indeed they are quite numerous, but there are very many federal employees who, in his view, are either not competent or driven by leftist ideology, who he would like to replace with people who are loyal to him. A couple of things on that. He does have some room for political appointments, number one. Last time around he was president, he didn't appoint an awful lot of them. So, there are political appointments, but there are very many civil service people who are on a career track who are there who have decent employee protections. So a couple of questions come up in that respect. How many civil servants could actually be replaced because of in terms and conditions of their employment? That's one question. The other question is how many people might there be ready to enlist as political appointees? What kind of numbers would there be? That's another entirely open question. There's also huge logistical issues involved in supplanting that many people, that amount of institutional knowledge. There's a whole host of different things. So while federal, and we tend to call them federal employees and not as civil servants in the same way, but they carry out very many of the same tasks, and they're there because originally, early in the American project, as it were, most of these jobs actually were political appointments, and it wasn't working because people were being appointed who weren't capable and competent, and in their wisdom, people came along and said, look, we need to have career people who work in this, who have expertise, who bring an awful lot to government and to people, in turn, to people's everyday lives. So that's the model that we've gone down. Now, the efforts to strip some of this out look, they're very real. They're worrying at many levels. The extent to which it can be done, however, that's another matter for that's open to question, and the amount of resources, et cetera, that would have to be put into it are absolutely massive.
So maybe I've got that wrong, Larry, that the federal bureaucracy, the non-political appointee federal bureaucracy is maybe bigger than I thought. Does that expression permanent government, is that ever used in the US? And are the career people, the non-political people, uh, very important in the system, or because my impression always had been that there were so many appointments made that the career people were not as important. But you know that better than me. So
Yeah.
question how you'd evaluate that.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think that, there are political appointments, and there's no doubt about that, but there are also career people within various agencies and organizations. I know it well because my own father was one of them, and who spend their careers working in these, and they make a real difference in people's lives, and they're not there because of ideology, et cetera, but because they care. Now, of course, if you look at various organs like the Department of Justice, for instance, its policies, how it acts, it varies administration by administration. So alongside these sort of permanent people, you also have the political people who come in and come out as election cycles go on. So you have competing tracks. The other thing that I think is really worth saying is the outside looking in, the perception is that these federal employees are all in and around Washington, D.C. The fact is they're all over the United States. This is not just, as Trump would put it, they're not just all in the swamp, and his doing this is not just going to clean out the swamp. They're in blue state America, they're in red state America. They're doing the important functions of government, and they're doing so, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for this. They're doing so, as you say, in a context in which the disposition at the top, it tends to vary by every 4 years. You can have a marked change in disposition, and perhaps depending on how this election goes, we might have a very marked change in disposition. And we do see things like Project 2025, authored by the Heritage Foundation, which is proposing to do an awful lot of this stuff on a grand scale. And again, that is to fit the worldview of people involved in the Heritage Foundation. But I always kind of try to temper whether it's left-wing ideology or initiatives, or right-wing ideology or initiatives, with a dose of reality. And an awful lot of this stuff is easier said, easier drafted a 900-page document than it is actually done and executed.
Okay, so that was exactly going to be my next question, was this Project 2025. So for those not familiar with it, there was a view that the first Trump administration did much less than it could have done because all of these appointments weren't made and it was chaotic, and it was like, as some people have said, the dog that got the car. In this case, the Project 2025 has been trying to recruit people to hit the ground running, to populate the bureaucracy, and to have an agenda. So it's a huge document. But recently, Trump distanced himself from it. Do you have any idea what the relationship between Trump and the Project 2025 people is? Was that a way of Trump just distancing himself from the 900-page document? Or is that genuine, that he's not really connected with them? And again, when he comes to power, he may find that he just doesn't have the people to put in place, and that itself might be a constraint on his capacity to exercise power.
Well, there's a couple of things worth saying. Look, the people who are behind Project 2025, they are in the Trump orbit. There's no doubt about that. They are in and around the administration. They are friends with people who would have been the intellectual firepower behind what is now modern day conservatism. So yes, there is that truth. Project 2025 is also about a lot more than just the organs of government and the civil service. There is a substantive content to it as well, a whole array of, I suppose, a right-wing agenda. It's a blueprint for a right-wing agenda. Now, my own view is that Trump has pivoted away because he recognizes the political danger inherent in it. Even something as simple as the label, Project 2025, that sort of sends chills down the average voter's spine, who says, what does that sound? That sounds like some sort of foreign plot. I don't like the sound of that. I think Trump is acutely aware of that sort of thing. And I'd also say Trump is a lot more spur of the moment, a lot more soundbite than he is 900-page document spelling out detailed proposals for initiatives. So I think there's probably Trump would probably salute some of the overarching goals here. But whether he's fully on board, I would have my doubts. I suspect that there are others in the conservative movement who would be strongly on side with these goals, and I would include in that number, I would include J.D. Vance. But and in terms of you reverted to numbers there a minute ago. They say that they have around 20,000 people who are ready, willing, and able to come into these roles. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's what the line has been, that they have 20,000 at the ready. And again, in a context of a federal government that has many, many, many thousands of employees, that's not a huge number, but their contention is that that's what they need to make the sweeping changes that need to be made.
Okay. Okay. Um, Moving on to another possible constraint on power in a country like the US is vested interests, and vested interests are always powerful, particularly the US, where campaign funding is very important. Money is much more important in politics in the US than it is in most European countries. I think it would be fair to say. How much sway do you think those vested interests will have over a Trump administration, both directly in terms of having his ear, and then indirectly with Republican lawmakers, in the sense that if something is in the pipeline that could damage their interests, then they threaten to withhold funding from lawmakers, and they will then in turn signal to the president that they don't want to go through with something. So would vested interests be a block on a Trump presidency, or is he different again in this area?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, let's for a minute depersonalize. I mean, the reality is the amount of influence exerted by lobbyists over American politicians at every level, from the president all the way down to state legislators, is disturbing, and it comes down to the pernicious role played by the almighty dollar in American politics, which has been, I suppose, furthered by a series of Supreme Court decisions, which have said that money in American politics is the equivalent of speech and therefore entitled to First Amendment protection. Lobbyists on behalf of vested interests are the beneficiaries of that line of thinking, that line of precedent. So that's the first point to make. Now, in terms of where the lobbyists in Washington, D.C. line up, and Trump. Now, Trump, in his first campaign in 2016, he cast himself and continues to cast himself as the champion of the working person, the working individual, the forgotten person, someone who's going to put America first, someone who's going to make America great again, someone who opposes, for instance, trade deals and internationalization and globalization more broadly. Beyond what he could do on his own and beyond the margins, he actually didn't do a whole lot in those arenas. And one could argue, perhaps, that that was down in part to the influence of lobbyists, and the influence of most high-powered lobbies would not align with that agenda as readily. The one policy achievement he probably would point to is tax cuts, and again, obviously, there's a large lobby for that. So yeah, Trump is, going to, lobbyists will exert considerable influence, but here's the open question. In Trump, in a second term, unbridled from electoral constraints, not surrounded by experts in the administration, not surrounded by people who've been in and around the Washington bubble and who perhaps have overlapping contacts with some of these vested interests in Washington. Might he go off the reservation? Might he do things that run contrary to lobby groups that, for instance, would have always aligned with the Republican Party and the right wing? These are open questions. And in that context, especially when it comes to foreign policy, the one animating principle, and again, I know we're talking about these issues globally, but just to talk specifically to Trump for a second, the one animating principle he has always had is that the United States gets a raw deal, that the rest of the world benefits from the United States' largesse. and that he is going to put an end to that. And obviously, there would be very many in Washington who would be repelled by that idea. Very many vested interests would be repelled by that idea. I wonder if, again, because of the context, I wonder whether the lobbying and the vested interests in Washington might find themselves, they have a formidable foe in Donald Trump who's not willing to listen to the arguments that they might put forward on the other side.
Okay, and exactly onto that point, it's been noted that the proprietors of both the LA Times and Washington Post have both decided not to endorse a candidate, as has been typical for both of those newspapers. Does that signify that those vested interests, as often happens in a country with a tyrannical type of leader, is fear a factor? Is this something that, in fact, vested interests will be fearful and will want to keep their heads down for fear of falling out of favor with a president who's not prepared to, let's say, be restrained in the exercise of his power?
Yeah, Dan, I regret to say that that's probably true. I think fear and fear with respect to the bottom line, because after all, that's what they're in business to do. I'd say that there is a big element to that. One would struggle to come up with another reason for why they've made these decisions not to go down a particular direction or another, one direction or another. I would say on a global scale, I wonder nowadays, again, given this is more to do with the United States media landscape. I just wonder, and this is, maybe a philosophical thought, maybe a little bit off the reservation, but I just wonder, especially in the United States, about why it's a good idea necessarily to endorse a candidate, one candidate or another, in the context of coverage. And shouldn't it be the idea that, and maybe this is the Boy Scout naive young guy in me, that whatever's left, that they cover the election fairly and squarely, deliver the information to the people, and let them make up their minds. So, of course, I worry as to why this decision was made. But maybe in the long term, it's a better thing in a poisonous media landscape that more outlets decide we're not going to take a side one way or the other.
Yeah, interesting. That's the position of the Wall Street Journal. They haven't endorsed anyone since 1928, and I don't think anybody would call the folks of the Wall Street Journal naive. I've seen some polling show, particularly younger people, that there's actually been a decline in support for democracy over time. And I know America's so polarized now that one side will see something and say it's okay, and the other side will scream blue murder at everything the other side does. But if you had a president that really started doing things that there was some consensus on exceeded power, how much of a ground, is America so polarized that simply there wouldn't be a groundswell? Or do you think the American people still fundamentally believe in the constitutional, and if they saw a president that was overstepping the mark, there would be a backlash?
I do. I think that there are a small number of partisans, who take the view that, look, a little bit of dictatorship wouldn't go astray. I think there's a very small number of people like that. But I think the vast majority of Americans still believe in the civic religion, or the sacred tenets of the civic religion that is inculcated in us from a very early age. And I wouldn't have huge worries on that front. I think the vast majority of people were a president to go well beyond what the founding fathers had ever intended, that there would be a huge groundswell of opposition to it. And then in terms of the structures of government, I suspect that opposition would go through the legislative framework, through the judicial framework, and permeate all our institutions up to and including, if necessary, and I don't want to be doomsday, if necessary, the United States military.
So let me just bring it to a conclusion. On the 31st of October, 2028, do you think that America will be in the concluding days of a fully free and fair election, as has been the case in the past for so many, for a quarter of a millennium almost?
Do I think that, maybe say the first part of the question again, Dan?
That Americans will be ending a campaign that has been a fully free and fair election process this day, 4 years from now?
that we'll still have a free and fair election 4 years from
Yeah.
now? Yes, I do believe so. And I say that with a pretty good degree of confidence. I'm not one of those people who believes that I believe America has a lot of difficulties. I've spoken before about the American societal model being broken and needing to be fixed. And American democracy absolutely facing an enormous amount of challenges. There's no doubt about that. But I hearken back to the dark day that was the 6th of January at 2021. And I'm reminded that even though they weren't adequately prepared, the institutions bent, but they didn't break. And I think in a context now where, for all sorts of reasons, we are aware of the fragility of democracy, not just in the United States, but throughout the Western world, that the level of preparedness, the level of readiness is there. And I hope that the level of public awareness is growing, because I do believe those who say a bit of dictatorship wouldn't go astray. They are a tiny minority. I think most of us are still animated by the core values of democracy that I think have worked reasonably well for us.
Right. Yeah. And of course, the world is going through what's called a democratic recession, and it can never be taken for granted in any country. I think it's fair to say. Larry, we've come to the end of our 45 minutes. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I hope it's been useful to our members who've been listening and watching. And many thanks to you again for joining us. Thank you, Larry. Have a good afternoon.
Appreciate it, Dan. Thank you.